She heard voices from inside the wall. But on the other side, there was only concrete. The October wind whistled through the narrow streets of Boston's Back Bay as Claire Peterson lugged the last of her moving boxes up the creaking stairs to apartment 3B. At 32, starting over wasn't exactly what she'd planned, but after the mess at her old firm in Chicago, a fresh start was exactly what she needed. The building on Marlborough Street had character, as her realtor had euphemistically put it. Built in the 1880s, it bore its age with dignity, high ceilings, crown molding, and windows that rattled when the tea rumbled past on nearby Boylston. Claire didn't mind. The rent was reasonable, suspiciously so for this neighborhood, and the location perfect for her new job at the museum. That first week, she blamed the sounds on fatigue. Moving was exhausting, and her mind was playing tricks on her. The whispers she heard at night were probably just pipes, or the wind finding its way through old walls. But by the second week, she couldn't ignore it anymore. It always started around 2 a.m. A soft murmur, like someone talking in their sleep, coming from the wall beside her bed. Claire had tried pressing her ear against the cool plaster, straining to make out words, but they remained maddeningly unclear. Just when she thought she could almost understand them, they would fade away, leaving her wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself one morning, staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Dark circles had formed under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. Old buildings make noise. It's probably just the heating system. But the heating wasn't even on yet, it was barely cold enough for that. And the whispers had a distinctly human quality that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Claire decided to be methodical about it. She started keeping a log of the sounds, times, duration, any patterns she could detect. After a week, she had confirmed that they always began between 2 o'clock and 2:15 a.m., lasted approximately 20 minutes, and seemed to come from the same spot in the wall, about 4 feet up from the floor, right beside where her headboard rested. She tried sleeping on the couch for a few nights, but even there, she found herself lying awake, straining to hear. The whispers had gotten under her skin, like an itch she couldn't scratch. Finally, she decided to talk to her neighbors. The elderly couple across the hall, the Hendersons, had lived in the building for 40 years. They invited her in for tea and listened politely to her carefully worded questions about unusual sounds in the building. "Oh, these old places, they're full of strange noises," Mrs. Henderson said, stirring honey into her tea. "You'll get used to it, dear." "But specifically about apartment 3A, next door to me," Claire began. Mr. Henderson's bushy eyebrows drew together. 3A. That's been empty for years. Not since the renovation in 19. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Empty. But I hear. She stopped herself. These were her new neighbors, she didn't want them thinking she was crazy. "I mean, I thought I heard someone moving around in there." The Hendersons exchanged a look that made Claire's stomach tighten. "You might want to talk to Mr. Gavin, the building manager," Mrs. Henderson said finally. "He knows all about the building's history." Claire nodded, but she already knew what she had to do first. That night, she waited until she heard the familiar sounds begin. Her heart pounding, she pressed her ear against the wall and whispered back, "Is someone there?" The murmuring stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, clear as a bell, a voice responded, "You can hear me?" Claire stumbled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. The voice had been young, female, and terrifyingly clear. She fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight app with trembling fingers. The beam revealed nothing but the same eggshell-colored wall she'd been staring at for weeks. "I'm calling the police," she announced to the empty room, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please don't." The voice was barely a whisper now. "I've been trying so long to find someone who could hear me." Claire's forensic training from her days processing insurance fraud kicked in. Document everything. Create a record. She hit the voice memo button on her phone. "Who are you?" she demanded. "How are you doing this?" "My name is Sarah. Sarah Winters." A pause. "I lived here. Before." "Before what?" But the voice had faded again, leaving only the hollow silence of the old building. Claire spent the rest of the night on her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard as she dug through local news archives and property records. Sarah Winters. The name felt familiar, but she couldn't place it. By dawn, she had found nothing, no records of a Sarah Winters ever living in the building, no mysterious disappearances, nothing that would explain the voice in her wall. She did find something else, though. In 2019, the building had undergone major renovations after a small fire in apartment 3A. The damage had been minimal, but the insurance company, Claire's stomach lurched when she recognized the name of her former employer, had paid out a surprisingly large settlement. When she finally dragged herself to work at the museum that morning, Claire could barely focus on cataloging the new Victorian-era exhibits. Her mind kept drifting back to the voice, to Sarah Winters, to the mysterious fire and the insurance payout. During her lunch break, she called the one person who might be able to help her make sense of it all. "Marcus? It's Claire Peterson." She hesitated. "I know we haven't talked since everything happened at Consolidated. But I need your help with something." Marcus Chong had been her colleague in the forensic accounting department, the only one who'd stood by her when she'd flagged those suspicious claims last year. The ones that had ultimately cost her her job. "Claire." His voice was guarded. "What's going on?" "I need you to look up an insurance claim from 2019. A fire at 247, Marlborough Street in Boston. There's something not right about it." "You're not serious." Marcus lowered his voice. "After what happened in Chicago, you're still digging into old claims." "This is different. I live here now, and there's something." She trailed off, realizing how it would sound if she mentioned the voice in the wall. "Just trust me. Can you access the file?" There was a long pause. "Give me a day," he said finally. "But Claire. Be careful. You know how these things can go sideways." That evening, Claire knocked on Mr. Gavin's door. The building manager was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually distracted air. He blinked at her in surprise when she asked about the fire. "Oh, that old business," he said, shuffling through a filing cabinet. "Nothing serious, really. Just some faulty wiring in 3A. Insurance covered everything." "And the tenant?" "In 3A. No tenant then. Place was being renovated." He pushed his glasses up his nose. "Why do you ask?" "I'm just trying to understand the building's history," Claire said carefully. "And I was wondering if you'd ever heard of someone named Sarah Winters living here." Mr. Gavin's hand froze on the filing cabinet drawer. "Where did you hear that name?" "So you know it?" "I think you should go, Miss Peterson." His voice had lost its distracted quality. Some histories are better left alone. Back in her apartment, Claire paced the floor, waiting for night to fall. She had set up her phone to record any sounds, placed a digital thermometer near the wall to track temperature changes, and even borrowed an EMF meter from the museum's restoration department, claiming she was checking for electrical issues in her apartment. At exactly 2:07 a.m., the whispers began again. The EMF meter's display jumped, its reading spiking well above normal levels. The temperature near the wall dropped several degrees. "Sarah?" Claire spoke softly, her phone recording. "Sarah Winters? You looked for me." It wasn't a question. The voice seemed stronger tonight, more present. "Yes. There's no record of you living here." "Why is that?" A sound like a distant laugh. "There wouldn't be. Not under that name." A pause. "Check the insurance claim. Look for Elizabeth Shaw." Claire's hands shook as she wrote down the name. The fire in 3A, were you there? Not exactly. The voice grew fainter. The renovation, they found something. Behind the walls. Mr. Gavin, he called the insurance company. Said it would be easier, if no one knew. The EMF meter shrieked, its display flashing error codes. The temperature plummeted further, and Claire's breath came out in visible puffs. Sarah, what did they find? What are you trying to tell me? But only silence answered. Claire barely slept. At dawn, she sent Marcus a text with the new name, Elizabeth Shaw. His response came within minutes, don't go to work. Coming to Boston. This is bigger than you know. She called in sick to the museum and spent the morning doing her own research. Elizabeth Shaw had been a tenant in 3A in the early 2000s. A graduate student at Boston University, studying architectural history. She had been writing a thesis on secret spaces in Victorian-era buildings, specifically, on hidden rooms and passages used during the Underground Railroad. Then, in 2003, Elizabeth Shaw had simply vanished. The police investigation found nothing suspicious. She had no family to push for answers. Eventually, the case went cold. Claire was so absorbed in her research that she almost missed the sound of keys in her door. She looked up, startled, only Mr. Gavin had a master key. The door swung open before she could reach it. Two men in dark suits entered. Neither was Mr. Gavin. Miss Peterson. The taller one showed her a badge too quickly to read. We need to talk about your interest in the Shaw case. I don't know what you're talking about. Claire's hand inched toward her phone. You can't just come in here. Actually, we can. The shorter man smiled without warmth. We represent Consolidated Insurance's Special Investigations Unit. You signed quite a few interesting documents when you left the company. Claire's blood ran cold. The non-disclosure agreement. The one they'd forced her to sign in exchange for not pressing charges over her unauthorized access to sealed files. This building has some fascinating structural quirks, the taller man said, running his hand along the wall, the same wall the voice came from. Load-bearing walls that aren't on any plans. Spaces that don't quite add up. The kind of spaces a curious graduate student might have found interesting, his partner added. Or a former forensic accountant with a habit of asking inconvenient questions. Claire's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, don't trust anyone from company. Evidence Elizabeth Shaw found something. Proof of historic fraud. On my way. The taller man's hand shot out, grabbing her phone before she could delete the message. His smile widened as he read it. Miss Peterson, why don't you come with us? We have some questions about your recent communications with Mr. Chang. I want to call a lawyer. Now, why would you need a lawyer? The shorter man stepped closer. We're just having a friendly conversation about a very old insurance claim. Unless, there's something else you'd like to tell us about. A loud crash from the apartment next door, from 3A, made them all jump. The sound of breaking glass, then footsteps. Check it, the taller man ordered his partner, drawing a gun that Claire was quite sure wasn't legal for an insurance investigator to carry. The shorter man slipped out. A moment later, they heard his shout, the wall. Someone's opened. Then silence. The taller man kept his gun trained on Claire while backing toward the door. Don't move, he ordered, then stepped into the hallway. Claire heard him call out, Stevens. Report. No response. The moment he disappeared through the doorway, Claire bolted for her bedroom. She slammed the door shut, bracing a chair under the handle. From the hallway came sounds of a struggle, a muffled shout, then another crash. Her hands trembling, she pressed against the wall where the voice always came from. Sarah, Elizabeth, if you're there, I could really use some help right now. The wall felt different under her fingers, warmer, almost vibrating. As she ran her hands over the surface, a section of the plaster seemed to give slightly. Claire dug her fingers into the edges of the irregularity and pulled. A chunk of plaster came away, revealing old bricks beneath. One of them shifted under her touch. From the living room came the sound of footsteps. "Ms. Peterson." The taller man's voice was strained. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Claire pushed the loose brick. It slid backward with a grinding sound, and suddenly a larger section of the wall swung inward like a door. Beyond it lay darkness. The bedroom door shuddered as someone slammed against it. The chair legs scraped against the floor. Claire didn't hesitate. She squeezed through the opening into the narrow space beyond. The hidden door swung shut behind her just as she heard the bedroom door burst open. She found herself in a tight passage between walls. The space was pitch black and thick with dust. Claire pulled out her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam revealed a narrow corridor that seemed to run the length of the building. The walls were bare brick, the floor simple wooden planks. Here and there, she could see small holes in the walls, viewing ports into the surrounding apartments. "My God," she whispered. Elizabeth found it. An underground railroad passage. Not just that. The voice came from behind her, clearer than ever. Claire spun around. A young woman stood there, flickering like an old film projection. She wore clothes that might have been current 20 years ago. Her form wasn't quite solid, but Claire could make out her features: short dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, an intense expression. Elizabeth Shaw. The figure nodded. "I found the passages while researching my thesis. But I also found something else. Evidence." She gestured down the corridor. The original building owner, Theodore Marlborough, he didn't just help escape slaves. He also ran an insurance scam. Claimed payments for lost property, people he'd actually helped escape. He kept records of everything. And Consolidated Insurance was the company he defrauded, Claire breathed. They're still covering it up. After all these years. The documents are still here. Hidden. Elizabeth's form flickered. "I tried to expose it, but Consolidated had too much to lose. Their reputation, millions in historical liability. Mr. Gavin called them when the renovation crew found one of the passages. They sent people, like the ones up there now. I ran into these walls, but..." She gestured to herself. "I never came out." A shout from above made them both look up. Dust filtered down as footsteps crossed the floor overhead. "They're searching the apartments," Elizabeth said. "Looking for access to the passages. We don't have much time." "Why help me?" Claire asked. "Why now?" "Because you're like me. You tried to expose their fraud once before, didn't you? In Chicago?" When Claire nodded, Elizabeth continued, "And because you could hear me. Do you know how long I've been trying to reach someone? To find someone who could help me finish what I started?" More footsteps overhead, moving closer. Someone was definitely searching for a way into the walls. "The evidence," Claire said. "Where is it?" "Follow me." Elizabeth's form began to move down the corridor. "And hurry. Your friend Marcus is coming, I can feel him in the building. But so are more of their people." Claire followed the ghostly figure through the hidden passages of the old building, her phone's flashlight beam bouncing off brick walls that had held their secrets for over a century. One secret had already turned deadly. Would exposing it finally bring peace to Elizabeth Shaw? And more importantly, would Claire live long enough to try? As if reading her thoughts, Elizabeth's voice drifted back, "Be careful what you wish for, Claire. I wanted to expose the truth too. Look where it got me." Somewhere above, a man shouted, "I think I found something." The sound of drilling began. They were running out of time. "Here." Elizabeth's form passed through a wall, then reappeared. Behind this panel. Claire ran her hands over the wooden wainscoting until she felt a slight catch. The panel swung open, revealing a small cavity. Inside lay a leather satchel, the kind graduate students carried 20 years ago. The leather was cracked and dusty, but the bag was intact. "Everything's there," Elizabeth said. Theodore Marlborough's ledgers, correspondence with the Underground Railroad, and the insurance documents. I even found letters from his descendants, discussing how to maintain the secret. One of them became a board member at Consolidated in the 1950s. The cover-up goes back generations. Claire pulled out her phone and began photographing documents as quickly as she could. Above them, the drilling had stopped, replaced by the sound of something heavy being moved. "They're coming," Elizabeth warned. "You need to." A shaft of light suddenly cut through the passage as a section of wall swung open 30 feet away. Marcus Chang stepped through, holding a flashlight. "Claire." "Marcus." "Thank God." Claire clutched the satchel. "We need to get out of here. The insurance investigators are right behind me," Marcus finished. His face was grim. "They have the building surrounded. But I called in some help before I came in. Federal agents are on their way." "He's telling the truth," Elizabeth said. "I can feel others arriving. But the insurance men are closing in." As if to confirm her words, they heard voices from both directions in the passage. Flashlight beams bounced off the brick walls. "This way," Elizabeth urged, leading them to what looked like a dead end. She pointed to a rusty ladder built into the wall. "It goes up to the roof. Theodore Marlborough's escape route of last resort." Claire slung the satchel across her body and grabbed the ladder. The metal was cold and flaking under her hands, but it held. Marcus followed close behind. They emerged through a hidden hatch just as the first light of dawn was touching the Boston skyline. The October wind whipped at their clothes as they crouched behind a ventilation unit. "The evidence," Marcus said, examining the contents of the satchel. "This is incredible. This isn't just proof of historical fraud, these letters show the companies actively working to hide evidence of their complicity in slavery. The PR nightmare alone would cost them billions." "Elizabeth Shaw found all this," Claire said. "And they killed her for it." Marcus looked up sharply. "How do you know that name?" Before Claire could answer, the roof hatch burst open. The two men in suits emerged, guns drawn. Behind them came Mr. Gavin, looking nervous. "Give us the satchel," the taller man demanded. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Actually, I think we do," Claire said. She nodded toward the street below, where several black SUVs were pulling up. Men and women in FBI windbreakers were pouring out. "It's over," Marcus added. "The Bureau's been building a case against Consolidated for years. They just needed evidence of the historical connection." The shorter man raised his gun. "If we can't bury the evidence," he began, but never finished the sentence. A sudden, powerful gust of wind swept across the roof. Claire could have sworn she saw a human shape in the swirling air. Both insurance men staggered, their guns flying from their hands. Mr. Gavin fell backward through the roof hatch with a cry of surprise. By the time the federal agents reached the roof, it was over. As Claire watched the insurance men being led away in handcuffs, she felt a familiar presence beside her. "Thank you," Elizabeth's voice said softly. "I can rest now." "I'm sorry about what happened to you," Claire whispered. "Don't be. The truth is finally out. That's what matters." The voice was fading. "The building will be quiet now. No more whispers in the walls. What will you do? Where will you go?" A sensation like a gentle breeze brushed Claire's cheek. "There are other secrets waiting to be uncovered. Other voices that need to be heard. Maybe I'll find them." Then she was gone. Later, after giving her statement to the FBI, Claire stood in her apartment, looking at the wall that had started everything. The hidden door was visible now, the brick passage beyond officially documented as a historical site. Consolidated Insurance's stock was in freefall as the story broke. Decades of corruption and cover-ups were coming to light. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, Bureau offering us both jobs in their forensic accounting division. Interested? Claire smiled. She'd moved to Boston looking for a fresh start, and she'd found one, just not the kind she'd expected. She looked at the wall one last time before texting back her response. Sometimes the truth whispers to us from strange places. The real mystery is whether we'll be brave enough to listen. In her bedroom, the EMF meter let out a single, quiet beep, then fell silent forever.